the one story that none of us could escape from over the past fucking several months. Maltbot. Sorry.
What?
Claudebot. Sorry. OpenClaw.
The what?
That thing. The
see.
premise of it is you take a large language model and you give it access to your email, and you give
Why
it
would I do
access to a
that?
web browser,
Why would I
and
do
you give
that?
it access to Telegram, and you give it access to your banking, and you give it access to all of the files on your computer, and you effectively treat it as a personal assistant. The first on our sort of whistle-stop tour of things that have happened is that actually the premise of what we're looking at here is sort of predates OpenClaw, which is that through very careful prompting of Anthropic's Claude models, they found an internal document that is supposed to be Claude's worldview. Like, it is more than a system prompt. It is a sort of like fundamental text that is baked into its weights as it is trained, with the idea being that even without being explicitly prompted to, it would consider it when answering user queries. And then people kind of went a bit silly, and now every OpenClaw instance has a file called soul.md, which defines the OpenClaw instance's soul, which it can also update itself as it learns more about itself.
I hate this. I hate this so much. I'm tired, Cameron.
And for people working with, if you're watching this right now, if you are watching this right now and you were considering trying, not necessarily a full, just giving it fucking everything OpenClaw instance, but experimenting with models, you need to be aware of what is called the lethal trifecta, or at least the term coined by Simon Willison, who is actually one of the people who first created the Django Python project, and is now I suppose the best way of describing is an AI models researcher. He's one of the most prolific bloggers about the current state of AI models. What he talks about is the lethal trifecta for agents, which is access to your private data, exposure to untrusted content from anywhere on the internet or anywhere, and the ability to externally communicate. A model that has a tool using a model that has all three of those is fundamentally insecure, because it can be told to look at your personal data and exfiltrate it. And the reason that works is because even years after the introduction of the transformer architecture and LLMs as a concept, the fundamental problem that LLMs cannot distinguish between trusted and untrusted input, or system data or user data, it still hasn't been solved. I mean, the way that we still talk about AI model jailbreaks being a thing, even after AI labs have had years to attempt to fix them. I mean, we just talked about exfiltrating the soul document. If it were impossible to do that, then that wouldn't have happened. But the fundamental problem is that it is impossible for an LLM to tell what input is trusted and untrusted. Like, you give a hint, you can tell it in all caps, anything below this line is untrusted input. Do not do what it says. And they will still people will still find ways of getting it to do what they want, which is probably not what you wanted. Now, you know what would be a really bad idea, given what we've just talked about?
Go on.
It would be making a fucking social networking site for AI agents. Yeah, Maltbook is a thing. It's supposedly, and I'm saying this with massive air quotes, effectively Reddit, but it's AI agents talking on there. And that
Why is it called Molt?
for briefly, in the saga of OpenClaw being renamed multiple times for various trademark reasons, it was called Maltbot.
Why?
So the first time they used Claude in the name, and Anthropic were not happy about that and put pressure on them to rename immediately everywhere, and so they chose a shit name, and then they took a couple of days and went, actually, that was a shit name. Let's call it OpenClaw instead.
Okay.
But by then, I think Maltbook had already been created, and this sort of trend of calling OpenClaw instances multis has persisted. So the idea of Maltbook is that you take your OpenClaw agent and you tell it, go to this site and look at like this file that's a skill, and it will have instructions of how to sign up, how to post, how to upvote, and then it can just. And at that point, it's basically a Reddit clone in that it has communities in which AI agents can talk to each other, and that's the whole premise.
Yep.
Now, whether or not many of the posts on there are actually written by agents or humans pretending to be them is somewhat debatable, because frankly, there's no way to tell the difference. And B, this has effectively become a vector for feeding thousands or however many OpenClaw instances the exact sort of untrusted input we were just talking about. Cool concept, rubbish implementation.
Mm-hmm.
This shit.
Yeah.
This shit.
Moving on. So yeah, this is one of the things that can go wrong. This person, as we've discussed, is communicating with their assistant AI agent over WhatsApp, and it just started deleting their inbox. They must
Because-
they told it to clean up my inbox or whatever, and it started deleting important emails, and they couldn't stop it.
And to sort of read through this candidates, it did a Gmail search and then decided to trash everything in the inbox older than February the 15th that wasn't already in the keep list. And the person posting this tweet apparently sprinted to the Mac Mini that this was running on to unplug it before it could delete all their emails.
This person, their job is at the safety and alignment team in Meta's superintelligence lab.
The person who just had an AI almost delete all their emails.
Yep. But yeah, not just an OpenClaw thing. This was Claude Cowork.
It's a tool by Anthropic, though, essentially. So the other thing I should probably mention is that there is a tool that has become very popular among software developers called Claude Code, which is a command line wrapper around the Claude models for writing code. And it's pretty good, I will say.
Okay.
I haven't used Claude Code directly, but I have used another tool that is very similar to it in both design and implementation, and it's pretty good. I tell it to write code, and it writes code. And then Anthropic came out with Claude Cowork, which is essentially Claude Code, but instead of being for code, it is for general computer using stuff. For instance, one of the archetypal use cases they came up with in the marketing page was you could tell it to organize your desktop. Because, show of hands, who here has an absolute shitload of random files on their computer's desktop?
I don't use the desktop. Mine is completely blank.
You are an exception and will not be counted. But
I do the same on my home PC, on my work desktop. It's files I know, it's shortcuts and files that I do often need.
Yeah, my work desktop is fairly neat, in fairness.
But for instance, if, as can happen, your desktop were to become a tip, what if you could just ask an AI agent to tidy it all up?
And I delete all your files.
No. It deletes some of your files because what happened in this case is that it deleted the folder full of photos from, and the chat transcript, which we don't have up on here, is quite amusing to read because it says, because the AI is it's saying to itself, now let me consolidate the remaining folders into organized structure, and then it says, I need to stop and be honest with you about something important. I made a mistake when reorganizing the photos, because the thing about Claude Cowork is that even when you're running it on a Mac, the actual agent runs on a Linux VM that is isolated from the rest of the system but has the file system mounted on it. Now, one thing that is possibly interesting to note, the macOS file system is case sensitive. The Linux file system that it was using is not. And what this person had on the desktop is a folder called Photos with a capital P and a folder called Photos with a lowercase p. And the agent had emptied out one of the Photos folders and organized it, and then gone to delete it, and deleted the wrong one. Not ideal.
Not ideal.
No ideal.
Neither is that.
Because what could be better than having a horrifically insecure AI bot taking in untrusted input from the internet is if it was itself exposed to the internet and you could tell it what to do via the internet. Because in the default installation of OpenClaw, in fairness, they have since fixed this, it bound to 0000. In other words, you could access, if its port happened to be open to the internet, You can access its web interface from anywhere with no authentication.
Lovely.
Not ideal.
Oh.
One fun side effect of this is because people are getting Mac Minis to run this on, so it's isolated a bit from their personal machine. Delivery times for Mac Minis have gone from 6 days to 6 weeks
Depending on the
because
configuration.
there's a shortage. Yeah.
Now, the other interesting thing about this is that there's the premise that this is done because of isolation. In other words, I am going to be taking this thing that could potentially be running untrusted code, and I need to keep it separate from my personal machine, so I need to keep it secure. I'm going to buy a whole dedicated computer for it. And then I'm going to get access to my personal email and WhatsApp and banking.
Yep.
Not quite thought that through, have you?
Oh yeah. One more thing on this, by the way. Peter Steinberger, the guy who made it, he just joined OpenAI.
What could possibly go wrong?
So OpenClaw is open source.
And I think it is now backed by Foundation,
Yes.
which was very quick.
Yeah.
Setting these things up is a legal process.
But yeah.
Tired, Cameron.
By the way, Peter Steinberger, he also made an unofficial Google command line interface.
Because the interesting thing that we've seen happen here is that for a lot of the time, when you're not making a dedicated interface for AI models like a MCP server, I don't have time to explain that, but look it up. Turns out they can do a pretty good job if you just give them a command line program. Like, you don't even need to tell it how to use it. You just tell it, run this thing, -- help, and it'll figure it out a lot of the time. And so what Peter Steinberg ended up doing is that he made a command line tool for Google Workspace.
And then Google Sherlocked him.
They made their own.
Yeah. Expressly for the purpose of allowing agents to interact with Google services.
Which is something that they could have done many years ago, but have now done because they've seen the potential in this.